Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. My special guest today is Paul Abbott, who is a musician and podcaster. With his colleagues Morgan and Stephen, he ran Hark, the 87th Precinct Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the 87th Precinct novels of Ed McBain. He's also the co-host with his brother Gary of the Big Beatles and 60s Sort Out podcast. Both podcasts are easily findable on Blue Sky and Instagram. Paul also plays in the indie band Good Grief, who are currently in the depths of making album number 2. Find them on Bandcamp and all streaming services. See if you can spot the song with the McBain inspiration. But now, let's go solve some cases with the boys and girls of the 87th Precinct as created by Ed McBain. Paul, it really is nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me. It's nice to get back into the waters of crime fiction, which I've been sort of sitting on the sidelines of for a little while. So thanks for the invite.
I can't imagine why you'd want to sit on the sidelines of crime fiction, but let me suck you back in. It'll be great. Before we get talking about wonderful McBainy things, let's start with my icebreaker question, which is, what's your definition of film noir?
So, film noir, it's a good teaser, this one, a good puzzler to think about, really, because every time you think you've settled on something, you come sort of unstuck, really, I think. For me, I think it's films that are demonstrating characters with a particular type of moral ambiguity, I think is where I find it, and it's usually the hero, quote marks, of the piece that's the one with the moral ambiguity, where you're sort of, as a viewer, you become sort of unsure of their motivations or how they're going to play out, what their actions are going to be. Because the villains are very often the easiest people to understand in crime fiction because they have very straightforward agendas for the most part. And it's the heroes that you sort of see struggling with their place in the world. Then I suppose on top of that, you've got the aesthetic of it as well, which of course is a period thing, and then there's the noir and the neo-noir, etc. and stuff like that. But, those sort of stylized portraits of places, cities in particular, and what do they conceal and reveal in the shots, and our old favourite expressionism in filmmaking as well, usually there somewhere along the lines. So it's, quite an umbrella term, really, isn't it? Because you can sort of have all those little subgenres within there. You can stick a comedy underneath it, but, more often than not, it's down the line crime.
I definitely try to make the case for comedy, crime, noir. It's there are a few that fit in, not enough, I feel. But it is amazing, isn't it, the way it gets glued on top of a whole bunch of genres. Some, I think, more convincingly. There are others, but there's always 2 or 3 that I think totally believably work within it. It's that thing, isn't it? It's, you see it, you know what it is, basically. And usually, if we accept that there's a broad definition at work here, is there a noir or neo-noir that you remember seeing early on and that made you think, oh, hang on, I've heard of this film noir thing, maybe this is what it is? Is there an initial film, something, a primal noir moment?
This was another ponderer. I think partly because, when you're younger, there was fewer channels on TV, and if there's a film on, you'd watch it, whatever it was, and it was probably something then. But the one that I most sort of recall, this is something that I talked to a couple of other people about, and they said, oh yeah, probably that as well, which is The Third Man. And I know you've had guests who've given this answer before as well. But the reason for that is we had a year in school where we could do an extra GCSE, and the extra GCSE I did was media studies. Our English teacher, who was the guy running the media studies course, got us to read The Third Man, that also started my love of Graham Greene books. But he was getting us to storyboard sequences from it, the opening sequence. And so we were doing that before he showed us the film. So at whatever age I was then, 15 or something like that. And it was like, wow, that is a heck of a film, and it sort of introduced me to that world a little bit. I think it's probably the first time I became properly aware of who Orson Welles was. I knew him very well because I love the Transformers, and he was the voice of Unicron in Transformers the movie. So, not the role that finished him off.
It was practically, wasn't it? I think
Yeah,
it was the
more
last
or
thing he
less.
did. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
That's harsh.
I mean, I love it, and yeah, coming across The Third Man definitely was the start of sort of going, oh, black and white things are good, and this sort of genre, this mystery, this sort of, do you know who everyone is, what they're thinking, what, you know, all that sort of stuff that you can then sort of go, oh, I saw a Private Eye film, or maybe, and then when you see something like the Humphrey Bogart stuff, for example, you sort of go, oh, I can see the commonalities here, things like that. But yeah, Third Man, I reckon.
Fantastic choice. So, okay, we've established that you've got good taste in literature, good taste in movies, obviously had
Thank you.
decent education. I'll tell you, that sounds great. I wish I'd had somebody who did that with me as a kid and sort of said, you imagine based on the text what it might look like. That's fantastic.
It was
I
great.
love the sound of that. Oh,
Very
that's
lucky.
brilliant. So, okay, at some point in your life, you obviously got interested in the work of Ed McBain, and we're going to be talking about his 87th Precinct novels. Before we talk about who Ed McBain really was, I was going to ask you rather, what got you interested in those books? And also, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up pointing in that direction?
Okie dokie. Well, if we deal with McBain first, really, I mean, I've always been a very voracious reader, and one of the nice things about when I got to university was I made some very good close friends who were also voracious readers, two of whom, Morgan and Stephen, were people I spent a lot of time with because we had shared houses and things like that, but we also spent a lot of time in the pub. And we spent a lot of time in the pub talking about movies. We talked about books, and we talked about music. Shared books, shared music, shared movies, things like that. I hadn't read any McBain, but Morgan and Steve-O had, and they talked about it enough to the point where I was like, oh, well, maybe I should try this at some point. And I hadn't planned to go and get any. I thought, well, if, you know, at some point I'll do it. And I walked into what's essentially a hardware shop here in Liverpool. But it's one of these things that's, they clearly just, whatever stock they can get, they'll put out on the shelves. And I found one of these 2 books in 1 editions of the 87th Precinct. I thought, aha, that's the thing they were talking about. I have that book with me now for my own, you know, reminding myself. A bumper omnibus edition, it says on the front, of The Heckler and See Them Die.
Oh,
Together at last. And now knowing the series, it's a very strange combo.
Very.
To put together, but yeah, that cost me all of £2 from, I think it was Chandler's in Liverpool. But it started me on the path. And then, because I've got a bit of a collector's spirit, it was like, oh, there's 55 of them, and they were talking about the characters being the same throughout the series. This feels like something I should go back and try and figure out, you know, if I can collect them all. And then you suddenly realise you see them all over the place in second-hand bookshops and things like that. And so that started me on that path, and it just went mad. And that's when, you know, a few years later, it was like I'm looking around for something to do a podcast about, and it was this seemed like a thing we could do. You know, it wasn't going to be writing anymore by that point because he was dead. So it was a closed set. We've got that there at the start, we got that there at the end. That's everything. We can tackle this. It won't take too long, we said. And then 6 or 7 years down the line, we're getting towards the end. So yeah, we did that. That started in 2016 and ran through till 2022. So it took in the time of the lockdowns and so forth. But we emerged having done it, and then we were going to do some roundups and extra bits, and we haven't yet, but we might. It's officially on hiatus. It hasn't ended, the Hark podcast. But
I was going to say, we should actually say, so this is Hark, the 87th Precinct podcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, as far as I understand it, still the only podcast in the world dedicated solely to Ed McBain's series of police procedural novels.
I have not found another one, so I certainly listen to it on that basis. I've not been matching and comparing with other sites, I promise.
Oh, fair enough. That's good.
I've been faithful.
Yeah. No, it was good to have a niche like that. I think that's the joy of podcasting, isn't it? You can plough a very specific furrow. But we also did like spin-off episodes about other things to do with Ed McBain. So me particularly leading the podcast is I'd get guests on to talk about something like his sci-fi work, which is a thing that most people won't know that Ed McBain did. So there was a TV episode called Appointment on Mars. So I got a guest on to talk about that, and then we'd talk about some of the 87th Precinct TV series that featured Leonard Nimoy, and then an episode of Star Trek that featured Robert Lansing, who played Steve Carell, and things like that as well. And looked at some of his juvenile fiction and some other films, which I'm sure we'll get around to at some point as well. But it was great. It's nice to do that, and it's nice to do that with my two best friends, and I do miss it. And maybe we'll be back eventually.
Oh, well, it'd be great if this was a way to encourage you to re-engage, because
let's see what the response is.
I'll let you know, I promise. Thanks very much for that. So I guess we should introduce the whole concept here. So the 87th Precinct series is this series of novels and a few short stories and I suppose a couple of novellas and technically one TV script. I think that's roughly the entire corpus as written by Ed McBain. And Ed McBain was a pseudonym for Evan Hunter. And Evan Hunter was a writer who was originally an Italian-American, actually born Salvatore Lombino. And at some point he decided, I think, was it an editor who said to him that he'd probably have trouble selling fiction as Sal Lombino or S.A. Lombino. And so he had his name legally changed to one of the pseudonyms he was already using, right, which was Evan Hunter.
Yes. So Evan Hunter went from being literally just a pen name to being his name. And the family is already married and had kids by that. Well, had he had the kids yet? Perhaps not. But, his wife clearly adopted the name Hunter as well. His kids didn't know any other name. So the Lombino name for him just was dead in the water, and he wouldn't use it. He wouldn't respond to it. So...
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
It's a big part of his psychological makeup that he can't shake off, and it was asked about for his entire life, and he addresses it quite often in the books for someone who doesn't want to talk about it. So.
I know, I'm always fascinated by, and we'll talk about it later, because it's all the kind of rubbish pseudonyms he has for the deaf man and things like that, which are like El Sordo being my particular favourite. Yeah. But that's because it's Italian. Sort of, and with a bit of Spanish thrown in, which really made me laugh. Have you read a lot of his sort of pseudonymous work, the outside of the two names, the kind of Kurt Cannon type stuff and things like that?
A fair bit, because I've been making an effort to try and collect all the short stories that crop up in things like Manhunt magazine.
Right. And
I haven't read all of them. But I have been, as I mentioned, my sort of collector's nature is try to find them all. Mm-hmm. And it's nice that people are putting up, PDFs of some of these things that would be otherwise absolutely inaccessible on things like the archive.org website and stuff like that. And occasionally a new tranche of missing ones will turn up, and you can dig in and find things. I've got the list of things in front of me here. It's a lot of short stories. I haven't found any of the war ones or the sports ones, because I think people are just less bothered about those. War and sports pulps are not as popular as the crime pulps for people collecting and sharing. But yeah, so some of the things like Carrera's Woman by Richard Marston from Manhunt, that's Evan Hunter. But that's in the same magazine that features a story called Attack by Hunt Collins, which is also Evan Hunter.
Yeah.
And it features a story called 2 by Evan Hunter. And it reveals very much why he used all these pseudonyms. He could sell lots of stories to the same magazine to be in the same issue, and he just never stopped writing. So yeah, I've read a fair few of those, and I've read a fair few of the Evan Hunter books, his proper literature as he thought, as he thought of it, really. And one or two of the other ones. It's a bit confusing now because a lot of stuff has been republished as McBain that wasn't McBain originally. Then there's some one-off names as well that are there. So, do you know what? I'll do a quick rundown of all his names so people know what to look out for.
Okay, go for it. Go on.
Right, so born S.A. Lombino, Salvatore Albert Lombino. Hunt Collins, Evan Hunter, becomes his legal name. Richard Marston, D.A. Adams, Ted Taine, Ed McBain, which only comes in with the 87th Precinct novels, Kurt Cannon, which is both the writer and the character, John Abbott, which I spotted because it's my surname, Ezra Hannon, and then something we probably can't get into because it's outside of the sort of scope of most of these things, Dean Hudson, possibly.
Well, I was going to ask you, what's your opinion about the Dean Hudson books? I mean, go on, tell the listeners about the house name Dean Hudson.
Well, if McBain was still alive and we mentioned this and said what we could say, he would be the first, like, on the phone to his lawyer instantly, because he always denied he was Dean Hudson, who was essentially the author credited to quite a lot of pulp erotica novels, which were supposedly, if you believe the stories, were Ed McBain and he was, or Evan Hunter, and he was basically paid with money under the table in brown paper bags, which funded his social lifestyle, let's say.
Extramarital activities, yes.
Oh, I suspect so, yes. If that, in fact, was the case that he was Dean Hudson, he denied it to the end of his days. His wife, Jajika, continues to deny that he was. Lawrence Block says he is.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because they were both at sort of Scott Meredith roughly in the late 50s around the same time.
Yeah.
And basically what Scott Meredith used to sell them, was it like $1,000 a go or something? And there were, 90 to 100 of these books, I think. And one suspects, given what people say about McBain, stroke Hunter, particularly when he was going through, I think, his first divorce, because it was a way of getting money, that wouldn't necessarily appear in the divorce settlement. And this is where I do get the lawyers sicked onto me. It's the kind of thing he might have done, maybe. Yeah. But at the same time, maybe a few, I suppose because when we look at some of the later books that he wrote, even for the 87th Precinct series, he did start to add a lot more sex to them.
Yes, definitely. And I think if you do any research into the character of the man, and I am fascinated by the man himself, if you do any research into the character of the man, or you speak to people who've known him, and I've spoken to a couple of people who've known him, it's quite hard to say. There's certain things I don't want to say, but yes, his interest in sex was lifelong, essentially. From the moment it entered into his life, I think it was essentially his main hobby. Well,
and who could argue with that?
Well, yeah, I think
it's certainly understandable.
Yeah, I think it was perhaps more than just something he liked doing. I think it was a compulsion and a lot of the things that happened in his life, which he ascribed to other things, were a cause of his proclivities. So, a tricky one without knowing to sort of make those leaps of judgment on the man. But it doesn't take too much to join the dots together and find that he liked doing author tours and talks because it meant he was in different cities every night. So,
would you mind giving me like a quick overview of the 87th Precinct series? How would you introduce that to someone who had never heard about it before?
Okay. So the 87th Precinct is a series of novels set in a fictional city based around the activities that happen to a specific group of cops. It's not attempting to do a whole big picture thing. It's focused in on one particular squad room, and it is police procedural. That term obviously has its various sort of origin points, but it's often held up as being one of the key examples, if not the key example, of what police procedural crime writing can be. Well, it's not unique now, but certainly made it pretty unique when it started, was the idea that it had this conglomerate hero. So the idea was that you didn't have one cop being the main guy in it. You had, this is the case held that this guy's looking at, this is the case that guy's looking at, this, and so on. Now, the truth of the matter is, with the 87th Precinct, you actually have a hero cop, someone who's in it all the way through as the main guy, whether McBain wants you,
he's sort of first amongst equals, yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. I like that.
And that's Steve Carella.
That's Steve Carella, who is from an Italian-American family. The one thing I'll say, if you read any Evan Hunter McBain, he never wrote an autobiography, but he is in almost every book he wrote. Someone is his cipher, and in some cases more direct than others. So Carella is, I think, what he would have liked to have been. The physical description of Carella is quite like McBain himself. Yeah. If you go off and read something like Evan Hunter's Streets of Gold, replace the job of the character with author, and you've got the nearest thing you get to an autobiography of Evan Hunter. So that sort of thing. And then sort of different aspects of his character come out in those cops. Anyway, that's aside. I wouldn't say this to someone I was introducing it to. Basically, conglomerate hero, squad room, not New York, but New York by another name. Fantastic, quick, usually, snappy, interesting, brilliant dialogue, and just addictive.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, as I say, you are one of the few people who, like me, has read all 55 of the volumes. So it's impressive, but I don't know many other people who can say that, even mystery fiction addicts. But I think it's probably fair to, give it a minor bit of context to this. We sort of went back and forth on this a little bit, but I suppose, okay, so I think if we want to talk about the police procedural as a genre or subgenre, it's probably worth saying that I think he definitely popularized the form. His books start coming out in 1956, and it's certainly, I think by this point, the longest and the most consistent series of its kind there's ever been. It did have some origins from before then. To my mind, the earliest popular example of it would be the Maigret series by Simenon, in the sense that it's about a cop and it's about some of his colleagues. And although his cop is always front and center, there's no getting away from it, that mixture of public and private, the domestic sphere and the work sphere, and that sense that you get to know what this man is really like, and that being important and not therefore just being a remote detective, as in so much fiction of the 20s and 30s, shall we say, this kind of aloof genius figure, but instead he's just someone who has good instincts about people. He was, when he's asked, do you have methods, can you explain your methods, Monsieur Maigret, he always says, nope, I don't have any. Thanks very much. And those were being translated, so those were becoming available around the world and in English language versions, although they'd started appearing in French in 1930. And then you get, almost on the cusp of the end of the Second World War, Lawrence Treat started writing a series of novels which had various characters who worked within a police force. And then towards the end of the 40s, very beginning of the 1950s, you've got a writer called Hilary Waugh, who's a terrific author and who wrote, for instance, a book called Last Seen Wearing, which is a fantastic police procedural and a really memorable one, but several others, all as part of a series, and that's kind of a New England set series of police procedurals. And there is this play called Detective Story by Sidney Kingsland, which got filmed and with Kirk Douglas in the lead role and was very popular at the time.
When we were talking before we started recording over the emails, you mentioned about Detective Story, and I thought, I don't know much about that, but it rings a bell. And then I was looking back over some stuff I'd written about this book I've got going on in the background. I'm trying to write about Evan Hunter. If you want nuggets of like absolute pure trivia to do with Evan Hunter, Detective Story was a Broadway play. It becomes a film later on, but it was done by quite a lot of amateur dramatics groups, of which Evan Hunter and his wife were members of an amateur dramatics group when they moved up to Connecticut. They were in the Poundridge Players, and in 1957 he starred in Detective Story on the stage.
Fantastic!
He played Charlie the burglar.
I had no idea. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it's great. It's amazing the things that you find in sort of well-to-do areas that have their own local papers, and they have all these social columns in the 1950s. So anyway, there you go. I knew I'd heard it somewhere, and I found that weird little link.
I think they all helped to build what we understand to be the police procedural as a form. Beyond that, we have to add something else, and I don't know how this is something that interests you or not, but there's something very interesting about the role of Dragnet. Well, do you want to talk a little bit of Dragnet? I mean, Dragnet's this unusual beast that's had this very, very long life.
But so anyone who's read the 87th Precinct will have spotted, particularly in the early part of the series, lots of references to Dragnet. And obviously that starts on radio for the best part of a decade and is, Joe Friday becomes a household name. Then it gets that TV series from the early 50s. It gets a film in the mid-50s and it comes back in the 60s and all that. So the ubiquity of that idea of having the straight cop in particular settings played almost as if it's ripped from the pages of reality type thing is very, very important in what Hunter does with the 87th Precinct stories, McBain does with the 87th Precinct stories. The other one as well, I think, there is Naked City too, which is as that phenomenal film in 1948, but that has a TV series. It starts a bit later on, but that film itself is so good, and that's proper, like, what's the phrase? There are 8 million stories in this city, and this is one of them, which is very much all of those things sort of create that vibe of semi-documentary sort of style. At no point does McBain present the 87th Precinct as if it's being looked at from the outside. You're there with the cops in the room, but he does do that verisimilitude thing of including photostats of things like fingerprint cards or all these various codes that they have for the different B sheets and DD reports and all these sorts of things and all the stuff that comes out of the police lab and things like that, which adds to this sort of sense of reality because he did go and do his research. But yeah, Dragnet is so clearly a massive thing that couldn't have not influenced him. And that's why he's obviously keeps putting these cops saying, "Who do you think I am?" Joe Friday, or, type thing.
It is fun, isn't it? I mean, I think all the references to there are several in the early books in the series. In a way, it's quite fun to see how those references will sort of change as the series progresses. By the time you get to later in the series, of course, he's referencing not Dragnet, but Hill Street Blues and
Kojak.
And Kojak, yes, and in fact, we'll get on to Hill Street Blues maybe a little bit later.
Yes.
I know you've got some interesting ideas about that one. So we start with this idea of the kind of the corporate hero. The thing about Dragnet is that it was all meant to be based on true stories from cases from the files of the LAPD, and the LAPD was in fact very heavily involved. And eventually, in fact, it led to a kind of, not a spin-off, but it has to be said, a bit of a copy, but quite a good one called The Lineup, which was the San Francisco Police Department from their files. I don't ever imagine that they were probably that closely based on reality for all the obvious reasons. I think they probably couldn't. Apart from anything else, I think they'd have gotten sued on a weekly basis. So I think that's extremely unlikely. But nonetheless, that was very much part of how you were selling it, this idea of, no, this is telling you something that you haven't really seen before because it's realistic and it's about how these things really happen. And so, I love all the kind of diagrams and photostats and little explanations that you get inside the books, particularly in the early books, I think. So how did the series come about? Isn't it all the fault of Earl Stanley Gardner's Perry Mason series? Isn't that right?
Kind of. Evan Hunter's born in 1926, and then the 87th Precinct starts in 1956, by which point he is a successful novelist. He hadn't been for long, but he had become one already at that point. So he'd done a lot of hard graft with these stories going to the magazines. He'd done Western sci-fi crime, sports, and then he'd essentially done a few books here and there, for a couple for kids, sci-fi type ones. He'd done a couple of sort of general crimey sort of things. But then Evan Hunter writes The Blackboard Jungle, and that's it. That's the smash he's waiting for. And also it's his proper book. So he's really excited about that. But he's still writing. He's a compulsive writer. He can't stop himself. So he's trying to find a publisher for a book called Cut Me In, which he'd written under the name Hunt Collins, and he sends it off to Pocket Books to try and get them to publish it. Or Scott Meredith does at the time, once his boss, now his agent. And their editor-in-chief, Herbert Alexander sort of goes, "Is this Evan Hunter?" Because he knew him. And he goes, "Yeah, it was." And he's like, "Fine, I'm not publishing your book, but do you want to come for dinner? Because Earl Stanley Gardner has been writing these Perry Mason books for so long now, he can't possibly keep it up." I don't know what led them to think that, because...
probably because of the TV show, right? And his involvement in that, maybe?
No, possibly, yeah. There must have been a reason, but they had... the impression I get is that they thought there was going to be a big gap where Earl Stanley Gardner and Perry Mason had been on the pocketbook schedules. And so they're sounding out authors, and they ask Evan Hunter, so do you think you could do a sort of continuing series if we start with, 3 books or something like that? Evan Hunter says, well, I'll have a think about it, and then goes away and thinks about it, and essentially goes, well, I don't want to do the maverick character in this setting. He doesn't want to do Miss Marple or Poirot or anything like that, or Perry Mason even though Perry Mason has more of an excuse for the things he's doing. It's like the only people who should be investigating crimes are the police, is his theory. So he goes back to Herb Alexander and says, look, here's my idea. The hero is the squad room. Herb Alexander says, good, here's a contract for 3 books, get on with it. And you get 3 books in a year, and that's the start of the 87th Precinct. And then they go, let's have another 3, and so on. And then by 7 or 8 books in, it's so established a series that it stops being paperback first, becomes hardback first. And that's obviously the point where it's like, yeah, this is making a big impact.
But in fact, I think those first 3 books, which are Cop Hater, The Pusher, and The Mugger, in that order. Am I getting the order wrong? I think those are the first 3, aren't they?
Yeah, Cop Hater, The Mugger, The Pusher.
There we go. And Cop Hater is a very interesting start to the series, just because it actually reuses a kind of Agatha Christie plot idea, but uses it in a way that you hadn't seen before, not with the cops. And in fact, those 3 books, all 3 of them, I think the rights to them to make a movie were snapped up pretty fast, weren't they? So I think they had a certain kind of impact right away.
Yeah, they definitely did. Cop Hater is brilliant. Because it's the first in the series, it gets to do something that none of the other books could do, which is introduce you to a squad room full of men you've never met before. You don't know who's going to be important. You don't know who's going to last the course of the book. I mean, you can sort of guess from the title Cop Hater that something bad's going to happen to a cop, at least one cop, but you don't know by the end of that book what's coming next. You can only do that once. They very quickly sell the rights, and the first 3 books become 3 films of varying quality quite quickly as well. So,
and in fact, it's interesting because he does knock off several cops in that first book, but we get certain things established and we get certain characters. We get Corella. He meets Teddy in the first one, doesn't he? Who will eventually become his wife. And we get Lieutenant Burns, who's the lieutenant or the lieutenant. So he's the head of the squadron. We get Maya and several other characters, including, and I think this was interesting, something that you would never have gotten on Dragnet, is Roger Haviland.
Yeah. I will say Maya doesn't turn up till the second book.
Till the second one, sorry.
No.
Yeah.
But you do get like a pretty packed squadron. You meet Bert Kling, who's not a detective at that point.
He's a patrolman, right?
Yeah. And Hal Willis even, who's sort of the second tier of story characters in there, but he's there from the first one. So I have a little chart in front of me here of my dossier of character appearances. If anyone gets killed, I put a little X in a box, and that first book is the one that's got 3 X's alongside it. But the very clever thing that he does, like I say, is he introduces Hank Bush, David Foster, and what's the other one, Michael Reardon, in exactly the same way as he introduces all the other characters. He doesn't skimp on description or stuff like that. And so if he'd have chosen to save any one of them but kill off Corella, you'd have had 50 years of that description of Mike Reardon every time he appeared or whatever. Yeah, Roger Haviland, his first thing they do, it's like, it's not just a bit of a bad cop. He is an absolute git. What's an international word for that?
Bastard.
Yeah, shitbag.
Yeah.
He's not nice at all. A thing they didn't carry forward into the TV series.
There's a shock. But you would never have had it in Dragnet. You wouldn't have had it in the lineup. Famously, there was, I think, when Dixon of Dock Green started in the mid-1950s in Britain, which was a spin-off from The Blue Lamp, a movie from the late 1940s. And
brilliant
you had the
film.
character of George Dixon, who had actually been killed off in the movie, apologies, spoilers, but was revived for the TV show, which then ran for 21 years. But famously, there was a fairly early episode about a bent copper, and they wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it. Yeah. And here instead, we've got a copper who's nasty and is violent and is just horrible. And it's one of the ways that I think those books distinguish themselves, and the way of being realistic about people as well. So one of the things about it, of course, there's a lot of really witty dialogue, but it's also quite plausible because the kind of speech rhythms are quite carefully replicated so they actually do sound like people talking to each other back and forth. And in those books, quite often you will just get, like a whole page, and it might just be a back and forth and dialogue. I mean, sometimes it's because they're questioning a suspect or something, and so it's just that. But sometimes it's just the detectives talking to each other. You talked about it being addictive. I think certainly that's always an absolute highlight. You says, oh, great, I'm going to get some dialogue now. It's going to be really good. And he never lost the touch for that. The last book, 2005, is just as funny. Well, none of it's just as funny, but it's still very funny, still witty, still very engaging. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it very rarely do you ever come across a bit that you think, oh, this just doesn't feel real. I was reading Tricks, and I read Killer's Wedge, in fact. And Killer's Wedge, a brilliant sequence where it's not just two people talking. You get the conversations overlaid, so it's like you're in the office and it's happening all around you. You're getting 3 lines here from these guys talking, then you're hearing the next bit, and he does it without spacing in the paragraphs and things like that. And so it becomes so it rattles along in you really do feel like you're in the mix of it.
And that's a great example, isn't it, of how he tried, and I think succeeded a lot of the time in really varying the books. It's not like a TV series of that era when you just have the same thing every week, and you'd get to the end of every episode and you just hit the reset button, and the next week it's like it never happened. So, you're horribly sad one week and you're completely fine the next week. And here you've got a book that combines 2 completely different plots. You've got a siege with this woman who holds basically the squadron hostage with nitroglycerin, while some of the cops are out there trying to solve a traditional locked room mystery. And part of that, they're complaining and saying, who does a locked room mystery? This isn't a John Dixon Carr story. Why isn't John Dixon Carr here to solve it? I just find that so clever. It's so aware. But the point is, he can do both. It's a perfectly good locked room mystery, and it's a really good siege story. So it's a thriller and a detective story all glued together. And it's a terrific book, I think. I mean, Killer's Wedge has been filmed multiple times, although mostly not in English.
Yeah, I've got a list. I mean, the list of adaptations of these, I think Killer's Wedge possibly takes the record for the most adaptations. He himself tried to get it put onto Broadway. So this is something you should know about Ed McBain. If people don't know this, he was essentially a really frustrated theatre writer as well, writer for the stage. He could not succeed getting stuff onto the stage, but he tried constantly. And the reason nobody knows this is because it never worked. I think he got one play on towards the end of his life, and he was booted off a couple of other things, and he always had something in production. So Killer's Wedge didn't get on the stage in 1958, but it did get on TV in 1961 in the 87th Precinct series. It became a film in France called La Soupe au Poulet. Please forgive my terrible pronunciation of that. That was in 1963. And this is another interesting one here. Well, most people will know about High and Low because it is a phenomenally good film based on an Ed McBain book. Most people don't know that the year after, Toho did another McBain adaptation on this book, which I've never seen and never be able to find a copy of. It's got a weird sort of title that in Japan that translates Fright Time or Time of Fear, something like that.
Right.
Kyofu no Jikan. Then there's a French television adaptation in 1968. That's the first episode of a Czechoslovakian series in 1970. There's a Japanese series in 1980. There's a Japanese series in 1992. There's a Ukrainian adaptation of it.
Oh my God.
And there's another Japanese adaptation of it in 2005. So he must have done something right when he wrote Killer's Wedge.
Well, I think it's a great book, but it's also one of the more unusual ones. But then again, I mean, and I know you've written about it elsewhere and talked about it, but of course, like I was saying, with Cop Hater, you didn't know sort of what would happen, who would live, who would die. Yeah. And he was planning to push that to extremes, wasn't he, with The Mugger, with the third book. I've got this right again, haven't I? I haven't got the
Pusher.
The Pusher.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that in. I'm not going to edit it out because I do love the books, but there you go. I can't always
This is
remember
an example of McBain style verisimilitude.
So The Pusher, which was the third and was the last book in that contract of 3 with Pocketbooks. And how was he going to end it? Tell us all about that ending.
Well, after the course of 3 books, he's more or less established Steve Carella as the heart of the squad room, and you're already fallen in love with him essentially through the first book. He's more or less absent through most of the second, which is odd. But by the time you get towards the end of the third book, you're really rooting for this guy, and you're rooting for the squad and his relationship within that, which is another bit of the McBain magic, is that within 3 books, one of which his character's barely in, you really start to invest in these links and relationships, not just the romantic ones that happen in there, but the squad room ones, particularly in this case with Lieutenant Peter Burns. At the end of The Pusher, original draft, original submission, McBain killed Steve Carella.
Oh.
Now, that's not a spoiler, unless you didn't know that and you're worried about the other side of it. But clearly what happened was the editors read this and went, you can't do this. He's clearly the hero. And McBain's going, no. I'm trying to prove that the squad room is the hero. It's a conglomerate, any one of these. This stuff happens. And they were like, no, but it's Steve Carella. I was talking to Otto Penzler, who knew from the Mysterious Bookshop, who knew McBain, and he said he read that original ending once.
Well, he published it in one of his books.
Did he do that in one of the books?
There's a book. Well, Penzler did. There's a book of Penzler's called The Great Detectives, which came out in 1978, which I've got a copy of. I can photostat you a copy, and it includes the ending. And it actually publishes the pages where he would have died at the end, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, not vastly, but it has the section. And in fact, if you want, I can read it out. Hang on a minute.
I know the last few words of it.
Yeah. So, well, I'll tell you what, I'll read this as I've got them written down. So it's outside the hospital, the church bells tolled. It was Christmas Day, and all was right with the world. But Steve Carella was dead. End of the book.
Oh, shivers.
That's a kick in the stomach.
Yeah, I mean, it would have had an impact at the time if that had come out like that. But imagine if you became an enthusiast by dipping into one of the later ones, and then you went back to the start and you started again, and then suddenly like, what? Who is this? Why? What?
So wiser heads prevailed, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, for once he listened to someone else and took some advice there.
It's probably worth saying. So the series on the one hand is going for a certain kind of realism, and they're successful enough so that he can keep this trajectory of both keeping the series varied, but at the same time trying to make it as plausible as possible. One of the fun things about it, which sort of you would think would mitigate against it, but it doesn't, is this idea that the books aren't set in New York, which they sort of clearly are. But at the beginning of every single book, all 55 of them, it says...
Shall I read it out?
Oh, go on. Yes.
I'll read it out, and I'll read it out from my Permabooks edition of Cop Hater, which is the only very first edition I've got of the very, very early ones. So this is how the very first 87th Precinct book starts. The city in these pages is imaginary. The people, the places are all fictitious. Only the police routine is based on established investigatory technique.
And it's complete lie.
yeah, it's more or less. Some of it is. He varies it once. Where it's a book where it's set outside of the city a little bit, and he puts the suburbs and exurbs mentioned specifically.
And then there is that late book where you think the book has started, and then they start referring to New York, and you're thinking, oh my God, he's forgotten.
Well,
which is great fun.
Well, that's possibly because he definitely does forget in some of them. Some of them, I'm sure, you get references to places in New York that I think he would have written as placeholders and then thought, I must come up with a name for that in this city, and doesn't go back and correct them. And that's why I think later on he starts to establish New York also exists.
I do love that idea that, yes, so New York is a real other place.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in terms of the geography, you take a map of New York City and you basically, you turn it 90 degrees clockwise? And
more or
basically
less, yeah.
That's kind of it, right? So Isola is Manhattan. Calms Point is Brooklyn. Riverhead is the Bronx. And I think my favorite the most transparent, Majesta is Queens.
Yes.
So, and several others.
Yeah, you get Bethtown is Staten Island and Diamondback is Harlem.
So they all have equivalents. It sort of doesn't matter, does it? In a way, that's partly the advantage of it being, shall we say, in a book. Visually, you don't have to have the problem of trying to sort of shoot it, let's say, somewhere on the East Coast and pretend that it isn't where it's supposed to be. But I mean, obviously, Kojak would be a good example where they did X amount of shooting in New York, but nonetheless, most of it was done in LA, just trying to make it look like New York. So you get this kind of curious mixing and matching of very real places, and no, that's the Burbank backlot and what have you.
Yeah.
He has this pretense, and in a way, it's quite beguiling. There's a charm to it, isn't it? I think
definitely.
Really.
Yeah, and because you very quickly start to put the pieces together, all right, so if he's describing that as that, then this must be such and such in the real world. It becomes that's part of the what makes the books addictive is finding those things and saying, okay, I know. So he's mentioned a new street. What's happening on that street and what's the equivalent in the real world? People have tried to map it. They've tried to map the 87th Precinct stories onto. I have tried and failed so far. But there are some big obvious things, like the 87th Precinct itself covers what would be the Upper West Side in Manhattan, which if you grow up in, as I did, the 80s and 90s, that's a very different sort of socio-economic space than it was in the 1950s. So the books are also, from reading them now, a nice history lesson of how things have changed and adapted in New York, even though it's not New York. It's Grover Park, not Central Park. It's the STEM instead of Broadway and stuff like that. But it's fun seeing how that plays out. But he does very quickly start putting them off into other bits of the city, because otherwise it would just be the same streets over and over and over again. So he will take them off into the places where things like King's Ransom happens, where it's a bit more, where they technically probably shouldn't be there, but it's an imaginary city, so he can do what he likes, really, things like that. But he never takes them very far away.
No, and in fact, he does. He gets out of it, but he slightly sticks himself in this bind, because they always are investigating homicides, but they're not supposed to be, because you've got sort of Monaghan and Monroe, who are supposed to be technically doing the homicides, and they're the kind of Tweedledum and Tweedledee of detectives. They're complete idiots. They invariably have to come up and say, okay, we're not going to bother with that. So the boys get to do it instead.
Yeah, he does definitely have to massage situations to make anything happen. You mentioned Monaghan and Monroe there, and I think they're a brilliant example of like ancillary characters that you're wishing for them to turn up, because they are always portrayed in a certain way. They have a particular vibe between them, and then the banter between them and the cops of the station houses and various things like that. So those are, again, part of the absolute joy and cleverness, is bringing these characters in again and giving you them like as a treat cameo. I said I was reading Tricks recently, and in that, Monaghan and Monroe are separated, and it's like these big sort of tough homicide cops are absolutely lost without each other. They only have these couple of scenes, but he very quickly sort of establishes how he was wondering where Monroe was, and then he cut to Monaghan. He was wondering where, or whatever, things like that. So you can fill this imaginary city with these wonderful characters.
Now, Tricks is actually, I think, one of the absolute best of the later books. I think, actually, I've always been a big fan of that one.
Yes.
I really like it, and we'll maybe get to talk about it a bit later. I have a particular feeling about a kind of even split between the series. I feel it reaches a certain point and then starts again, and I feel it's in many ways, for me anyway, less successful. People have different opinions about this. When I was blogging about them, I sort of got used to a certain amount of pushback from certain people who were very sensible people, and we just did not agree, which is very interesting. And I think it's partly to do with what you think should be in those books and what you will and won't put up with. I think that there is a interesting quality to how big the cast gets, and so you've got lots of potential different flavors, because while you kind of always want Maya and Corella and to be in it, Cotton Hawes is actually one of those characters who starts well, but then I feel slightly fades away. It's really odd. He gets used less and less, it seems to me, in some of the later books, for instance.
he gives him an attitude or a habit, which again is really reflective of Evan Hunter's proclivities. He's the one that likes the ladies, and he becomes a bit of a. That's his stamp in later books, and he doesn't do much else with him other than have him daydream about, women.
I mean, we probably ought to mention one aspect of it. I was going to save it for later, but the way that it handles time in the books, I think it is, again, talking about charm and the sort of slightly fantasy element. I mean, sometimes, the books are frequently extremely specific about the time of year. So it'll tell you even what day of the week it is, and sometimes it's one book picks up 2 weeks after the previous one, so you're in the same month, and it literally you talk about that happened 10 days earlier, even though the book is maybe published a year later. But there is just no getting away from the fact that we start off with Teddy and Steve, and Teddy is is a witness, isn't she? She's kind of this woman who Steve Carell meets, and they fall in love and they get married, and in the second book they're on their honeymoon, and I can't remember how quickly she gets pregnant, but it's pretty fast. And
they find out, in fact, in Killer's Wedge,
which is a fantastic book. So that's about 1960, so roughly 4 years have passed. They have twins, and I think by the time the series had ended 35 years later, I think the twins had they actually become teenagers yet? I mean, just maybe. Just. So basically, they're running at about what, sort of 3 or 4 years for in 87th Precinct years is equivalent to 1 year in regular years, and even that doesn't really work, because I think Maya is about 37 and so is Corella, and they're basically that age for the whole time, aren't they?
Nothing makes sense if you take it at face value. So he's done that thing. He kind of freezes time, and then he refers to that quite a lot in the books. It's like, in fact, again, in Tricks, you said something about an hour seemed to last a year in 87th Precinct. But it's great because it means he can use it as commentary on the time that it's set in, which is what's brilliant. I mean, this is a bit like the mapping, try to draw the map. People have tried to reconcile the timeline over the years and make it work, and that's enough to drive anyone mad. So whilst I can see from my notes that Cop Hater takes place on the 23rd of July to the 19th of August in 1956, and The Mugger takes place on the 12th to the 25th of September in the same year, and The Pusher takes place 18th of December to the 25th of December that year. After that, it's kind of anyone's guess. So you have to call that year one, not for 1956. And then you have to hope that when it's published, you've got some sort of equivalent. And it will drive you mad if you try and sort out the timelines for this, which, like I say, some people have tried to do. But yeah, the magical time, this is, it's not magical realism in the sense of things happening to characters. The magical realism is the idea that they can just be who they are in the time that the story is written, essentially.
In your podcast, you went through the books in chronological order, in publication order. And one of the things that I think is spectacularly successful about it as a series is that while there are, for instance, books like Fuzz, which are kind of done as comedies, and it's a favourite book. I really like it. I think the movie's okay, but I really like the book. And there are others that are very dark, very bleak, very noir, very hard-boiled. You get all kinds of flavours, all kinds of sort of different colours and shades. But one of the aspects of it that I think is intriguing is, do you feel like they build as they go along? Or do you think that he's just such a varied writer that he will just say, no, I'm going to try this now, and I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to, do you feel, was there a benefit for you in... Because that's what I did as well. I read them in chronological order, and I reread them, I should say. And I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a joy to be had in reading them in order, because you do get you get the same character descriptions over and over again when Steve Carell walks into a room, or you meet Maya for the first time, or any one of the ancillary characters turns up. But then a couple of books later, you'll get an extra line alongside it, and that'll become part of the character, and you carry that through with them. So you do get a build of this background without it overwhelming. So you do see home life for quite a few of them, but again, it doesn't overwhelm the core stories that he puts in there. When it does, it's some of the less successful things in there, when they're off in situations that aren't policing situations, where he breaks his own rule and puts them into situations where they shouldn't be doing police things, or has them investigating personal matters. The lieutenant saying, yeah, that's all right then. It's like, no, it's not. That's not all right in the slightest. Don't do that. That's very bad. But yeah, it does build. And what also I think he does in terms of reading them in order as well is you see some characters drop away. So like we were talking about Haviland as the awful cop, the worst example of a cop you could have. The problem is he's painted himself into a corner with that character because he's just bad. He clearly can't find a way to redeem him without sort of betraying what he's written before. So he gets rid of him. And if people want to find out what happens to Roger Haviland, then they need to read...
Is it Killer's Choice? Or...
Killer's Choice, yeah. But then he's found himself with this vacuum where you need, perhaps not a cop as bad as Haviland, but you need the shitty cop who doesn't want to do the job and is cutting corners. But you can give him a lot more scope. And so he invents Andy Parker, who you then have through the rest of the series and who you get a lot of brilliant mileage out of. But when he finds Andy Parker's not perhaps doing the job as effectively anymore, he invents Fat Ollie, and which breathes a whole new life into the series.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Fat Ollie Weeks because he starts to really predominate, and he isn't even from the 87th; he's from the 88th.
Yeah,
I mean, what do you think's going on with Fat Ollie Weeks? He even gets a book named after him, literally.
Yeah, he does. So clearly McBain was trying to write about writing quite a lot of the time in this period. In Tricks, Andy Parker is talking about writing a book. And then later on, Ollie Weeks takes over and that annoys Andy Parker, who's trying to write this book. And Ollie Weeks is convinced he's written a book, but it turns out to be sort of about 5 pages stuck together or something like that. McBain clearly wants to have a character who is terrible but brilliant. Andy Parker's terrible and bad at his job. Ollie Weeks is terrible human being but brilliant at his job, and it's a new dynamic again to throw in there. You feel Ollie Weeks come into it like it just explodes the series quite a bit because it's a whole new fresh energy to the thing. You feel like when he turns up, you feel like the guys in the 87th do. You sort of, your back goes up a bit like, oh God, what's he going to do now? And so it's
horribly racist, isn't he?
Oh,
He's just,
yeah.
know.
I mean, there's a certain amount of eat your cake and have it too with some of these things. And Ollie perhaps is an example of that because it allows McBain to use essentially racist language here and there and say, well, this is an example of a bad person doing it. And that's not always welcome, let's say, if you are a nice-minded person who finds some of this stuff quite difficult. I mean, that gets into what the 80s books are like compared to, say, the 50s book, where it feels less like social commentary and a bit more like characters saying things for the sake of saying things occasionally. It is all part of that build. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So some of the, like Hal Willis, has a very strange relationship story that dominates a couple of the bits later on. Seems totally out of keeping and quite ludicrous compared to the rest of the series. But you also, and we haven't mentioned this at all yet, you very early on get a supervillain.
Yes, let's talk about the Deaf Man, the arch nemesis of the 87th Precinct.
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to El Sordo earlier on, but by the time we get to book 12 in the series, which is only 4 years into the series being published, it's
because he really was keeping up that rhythm, wasn't he? Initially, that 3 books a year almost. He was.
It's an insane
amazing
work rate. Yeah, but yeah, you get in a book called The Heckler, you get the Deaf Man turns up and he's got I suppose you'd call it a caper. He does capers, although that makes it sound a lot funnier than they are. Because a lot of them are very, very violent. Mass slaughter in some cases is part of his plan. Well,
the Heckler, it's weird, isn't it? Because strictly speaking, a lot of people get killed in that book, and it all happens off screen, as it were. You sort of hear about it, and that somehow allows you to have this weirdly soft attitude to the Deaf Man, as this guy tries to pull off this giant caper, and usually the 87th foils it by mistake, almost. It's never, and yet I don't know how many people he kills in that, but it's a lot. He's a total bastard.
He's an absolute maniac, and what's even better is after the heckler, he's a maniac with a vengeance. So he'll give you a break of a little while, and then he'll give you another deaf man story, which, you know, if you're being strict about crime, you know, that wouldn't happen. You know, these things would not happen. If someone did what the deaf man did, he would have been hunted by the FBI, the United States Army, everyone. You know, and he would have been run to ground very quickly. But he's a very, very enigmatic character. So you get these little...
Well, he is kind of like a Moriarty thing in that one, isn't
Yeah,
it? 'Cause
and
it's almost like at Reichenbach Falls, almost, isn't it? He sort of dives into the river and isn't seen again for 8 years. Isn't that roughly it?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So you see him in the heckler, and then he turns up again in Fuzz.
Which is this comedy.
Yeah, which is a comedy. And like you say, he always somehow manages to turn the 87th Precinct into these... Well, I think they describe it as like Keystone Cops, don't they? You know, they're bumbling. Somehow he ties them in knots, but yet somehow he gets foiled. It's an incredible addition to that when you're reading it through aspect of it, that you start to see someone come back. And as this vendetta builds, and it focuses in on Steve Carella particularly. And McBain wrote the deaf man as like, well, what can I have? Who would be the opposite for Steve Carella? And you can write that sort of in character terms, but it's like, well, Steve Carella's, the love of his life is his wife Teddy, who is a deaf mute, to use the parlance of the time. And so he's like, well, his nemesis should be deaf as well. Or is he? We don't know. Is that his,
right? Yeah.
his shtick? So that was an interesting thing to do there. But yeah, absolute maniac. So it's always interesting when he turns up. And most of the books he turns up in are all right. Hark, which I named our podcast after before I'd read it, is not one of the best.
No, it's the last, isn't it? But not the best. Yeah.
Yeah, the last of the deaf man turning up, but it's yeah.
Because there's 6 of those, and roughly one a decade, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting. He did space them out. He didn't make it happen too often, which is probably quite a good idea.
Yeah. Definitely, because he would definitely have got bored. If he'd have turned up, it would have been a different every week. So talking like it's a TV program. If he'd have turned up every book, it would have been something else. And
well, it would have been like in that season of Doctor Who, where the Master is in every single story, you know, and that was kind of, you know, weird thing to do in the 70s. So, do you have a favourite of the Deaf Man books?
I'm a big
of them,
I'm a big fan of the Heckler because I do like that early period, and that's still within that sort of the vibe of that early set of books, and I think it's quite a good story for a caper. Fuzz, as you say, is pretty funny. 8 Black Horses, I haven't read that in a long time. I seem to remember that being okay.
It's pretty good. It's just a little bit too long, but it's solid.
When it gets to the point where he's sending cryptograms and things like that, it's, you know, literal puzzles, and there's tons and tons of reproductions in the book of these puzzles. It's all a bit, it feels a bit laboured as a notion by that point. When he's just being, you know, a maniac with a scheme, I think he's at his best.
There's something brilliant about the third one, which is called Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man.
Yes. Yeah.
And, but what I wanted to ask you was, I mean, obviously you must have favourite books in the series, and I have a lot of favourites in the series, so I couldn't possibly boil it down to 2 or 3 or something. I thought it'd be great to talk about favourites, but before we get into favourites a little bit, I wondered if you could suggest maybe 3 or 4 jumping on points to the series for people who haven't read them before, and who, apart from what we've been telling them right now, who might be intrigued and want to say, okay, so partly I've got to go out and buy one and find it, and they're pretty much all on Kindle and ebook formats and tons of paperbacks, and they're out there.
Yes.
Some of them are a teensy-weensy bit harder to find than others, but most of them can be found, particularly if you've got an e-reader. Are there books that you would recommend as a great place to get into it at different phases, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. It's a bit of a funny one because like you say, we're going on here about how great it is to read them in order and the build and all that sort of stuff. But it is, if you're dipping your toe in, it's where do you do it? And it's a bit like when you try to introduce new music to a friend. It's like if you give them the wrong album, that's it. They're off them for life. We who did the Hark podcast all like Frank Zappa, but that's a very challenging thing to introduce to someone if you give them the wrong period of Frank Zappa's music or something that they don't like. If you give them a jazz album and they only like rock. Anyway, but with that equivalent in mind. So the other thing I haven't said is when we did Hark, the 87th Precinct podcast, we rated the books And it's purely personal. It was an average based on our scores, how we liked it. And we were generally in step. So it meant that at the end of it, we did have a reckoning. But in terms of what I would actually say to people to go out and read, the ranking doesn't really relate to that at all.
Right, yeah.
Because the one that came out on top for us was Tricks. But that is,
right.
I think you have to have read them in order for that to be as effective as it is, rather than as a standalone thing, because it does draw quite a bit on things that have happened before that book. So, things that I think are brilliant, and these are sort of drawn partly from my first experiences of just picking them up wherever and just reading them as I got them. King's Ransom, which I like because it's a bit different. And obviously, if people have watched High and Low, they'll know perhaps of the link to that. Anyway, I think King's Ransom's very interesting. I do like to see some moral fury on the face of my cops, and that you see a bit of that with Steve Carella there.
So you think that's a good jumping on point?
I like it. I don't think it's not a good reflective one. It's not a typical one, because they're off out in the posh bit of the city. But I think it's a good story, very good story. Another one that I love from 1972, Sadie When She Died.
Oh yes, well that's pretty much my favourite.
Yeah, it's an absolutely brilliant book. It's dark and clever, and I like it when you can feel the footwork they're having to put in to get a case solved. The fact that they're going to have to go over there to talk to that person now. Now I'm going to have to go over there to talk to that person. You feel that you're with them on these, across the city all the time. But I'm very fond of Bread, which is from 1974. That was a very early one as well.
That's very underrated. That's from 1974, isn't it? And I think it's really underrated, because I remember thinking at the time when I read it last that this was one of the, at that time, I think it was the longest book he'd written. Most of them were about 50,000 words long, roughly 150 pages in paperback. And this one was noticeably longer. And I thought felt really substantial, and it just had a complicated story, and it handled it so well, and it's just an incredibly satisfying read. I'm so glad you mentioned that one, because I'm a big fan and people don't talk about it, and I think it's really worth pinpointing that one.
Yeah, it's a really good. I think that's a good jumping on point. It's the one I appear to have 3 copies of it now, because I bought the cheap paperback version, which you could find everywhere. I stumbled across a nice hardback somewhere, a British hardback, I think, in a secondhand bookshop that didn't cost much. And then when I went to New York for my first holiday in New York, I went to the Strand bookstore off Times Square. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I could have spent the rest of the holiday in there. But I treated myself to a signed first edition of that from the Strand bookstore.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't
Show me the cover.
It wasn't massive. Well, the cover is...
There's the cover.
It's
fantastic.
a sandwich made of money on fire. Which, if you read the book, makes sense.
And it's signed as Ed
McBain. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic.
So that was my treat to myself. It wasn't a massive amount of money, because he signed a lot of books. Yeah, I like Bread well enough that I've ended up with 3 copies of it. And I've never attempted to collect all editions. But yeah, I think if Sadie When She Died or Bread are brilliant starting points. It's wonderful. I enjoy the thrill of the hunt, though. So if you go into your local secondhand bookshop and you look for a McBain, you'll probably be all right with most of them, unless it's ghosts. Leave ghosts on the shelf. My opinion, but
Yes, okay. No. Well, that brings me to a secondary point, which is, so I was alluding to it earlier, which is that my feeling is that there's there's the first 20 years of the books, and then there's kind of everything else. So you start with Cop Hater, 1956. And Cop Hater, of course, is a perfectly reasonable place to start. But obviously, by this point, these are books that were published 70 years ago in that respect. So, of course, it's going to feel a bit more remote. In the first 20 years, he did, I suspect, most of his best work in the series. I think it's the most varied, the most witty, I think the most dynamic, and it's got most of my favourites were published. But it ends with one of my absolute least favourites, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And that's published in 1976. And at that point, it feels like the series has almost come to a sort of end in a strange way.
Yeah.
But then he sort of starts again. And in 1977, you got Long Time No See,
Yeah.
which, okay, is a jokey reference because the first murder victim's blind. But it kind of revisits Cop Hater, the first one. It sort of rethinks the plot from that one, repurposes it, doubles the length. And from then on, the books are going to be almost twice as long as all the ones that have come before it. And he's going to start adding more violence, certainly a lot more profanity. In itself, a loaded word. I use plenty of swearing, so I don't have a problem with it. And increasingly more amounts of sex. And I think that the books that he then published in what are, the next 30 years of writing are not mostly as successful, partly because I think that to get to that length, he seems to quite often involve a certain amount of padding. I feel that it's just to do with market conditions. I don't think something weird happened to Ed McBain in 1976. I think what happened is that his editor sort of said, okay, books are costing more. It's the era of the blockbuster, the kind of Arthur Haley, James Clavell, these Harold Robbins even, but, these very long books. And since they're going to come out and pay hardback first, and you've got television that's now made massive inroads into particularly the genre, let's face it. Not just this, it used to be Westerns, now it's cop shows. You have to offer more bangs for your bucks. And it seems to me that that's sort of what happened to the series, which is not weird. It's a perfectly respectable reason for changing style. How do you think about that? That's always been my feeling about it.
I agree. And one of the ways you can tell this is if you're looking for these books in secondhand bookshops, up to the period you're talking about, the first half of the 87th Precinct, let's say, you'll see them almost always as paperback. From then on, they're mainly hardback, blockbuster type presentation. They're obviously also made available in paperback as well, and you will find those, but you'll see a lot of hardback editions of some of the later books on shelves that you would never see of the early ones. So that tells you so even though not all of the early ones were just paperback, that was their primary format. When we get to that big blocky hard spine big book, it's doing exactly what you're saying. The market is demanding more of him. You can sort of look at his output and analyze it a little bit, because in 1977 he starts doing the Matthew Hope series as well, where he's moved to Florida himself and he starts writing about a guy who's in Florida. I don't like the Matthew Hope books. I've read a couple of them and I've struggled with them. I will get through them eventually, but it's just not as enjoyable thing. His lawyer who somehow is investigating crimes. Yeah, that's not really what they do. It doesn't stop TV doing it, does it? So,
yeah.
But also, his success as Evan Hunter as a writer is paling by this point. He's struggling to have a hit as Evan Hunter, and I think there's a certain, I want to be Evan Hunter, not Ed McBain, and it's twisting him a little bit, and then he sort of gives into it because the Evan Hunter books, although they're still appearing, are just not doing as well. And so he throws himself into chunky 87th Precinct writing in this period, because I've got my little list of his output here at this point. What you get a novel by Evan Hunter called Love Dad in 1981. You get Far From the Sea in 1983, and Lizzie, which was a bit of a turning point. So he writes his book about his fictionalized telling of the Lizzie Borden story, which is still influencing people's take on that story now. But it was a total flop because another book came out at the same time about the same subject and did it better. And that really put him off being Evan Hunter. And so all those 87th Precinct books from there on in, he dedicates more of his time to filling those books with pages. So I think that's where you can see it in his habits and attitudes through his own writing. But the market force is definitely the driving thing there. The contract now will say, we want this many pages. And I've got the list of the publishers up here as well. I'm wondering whether the big break is in that. Signs with Viking Press in 1979, but then very quickly gets to 1983, gets to Arbor House, and that's where they start to become bigger. Then when it carries on with William Morrow as well. So different publishers, different requirements.
Yeah. And I think it's a bit of a shame. I mean, it's kind of the standard view. So one wants to resist that a little bit, because I think there's a lot of good stuff there all the same. I mean, sometimes you feel like, you know what, I could take out 3 of the subplots and it's an excellent book. You
Yeah.
know, so in a way it's kind of like, okay, you know, there are certain things I have to put up with. It's a shame, but you know what? It's still there. It's still good. He's still writing really well. And considering how long by this point the series has been running,
Yes.
I think is astonishing achievement, really. I mean, if you consider what happened with a lot of long running series, you know, whether it's, you know, your Poirot, your Miss Marple or whatever. I mean, Miss Marple is only 12 books anyway, but you know, and they're not good comparisons, but those trailed off, you know, way before McBain's books started to feel a little bit different. And also he's got a couple I don't like. I mean, I was going to ask you about this. I suppose it's kind of mean thing to bring up, but okay. We've talked about ones that are interesting jumping on points for people, that people should try to see if it's something that would get their interest, that would give them a good representative flavor of the series. I mean, I would probably add a few other books myself. I think I would probably, for instance, I think things like Killers Pay Off or See Them Die, even, I think are really good books, and they're interesting ways in. But there are some that I think you should definitely not start with, because I think they're totally going to give you the wrong impression, or as you say, you're going to be pushing them. So be fair. What would be the 2 or 3 books that you would say, please don't start with this one, no matter how cheap it is on the internet to buy, because you won't read another one afterwards? Are there books like that for you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, towards the end, I think he picks up again in some of his later ones. Like Money, Money, Money's, I think, is pretty good, and Fat Ollie's book, I think, is
Money, Money, Money was a very popular one. You know that?
Yeah, he did a lot
sold
of
really
press for
well,
that.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. When he goes back to Simon and Schuster towards the end of his career, and somehow it seems to sort of revive it a little bit. But during that period, he does put out the Frumious Bandersnatch, which I detest. I'm a musician, and when people are writing about something you know at least a little bit about, and they're not getting it right, it really rubs you the wrong way. So he's had books where he said it in the theatre, but he knew about the theatre because he spent his entire life frustratedly trying to get plays on and stuff like that, and clearly hung around with theatre people and spent a lot of time with it. The Frumious Bandersnatch, he's tried to do music things, and it's just, it came out on our Hark rankings as the lowest one, and the lowest one by quite some margin as well.
Ooh. So okay, skip that one.
Yeah, so
even if you like Lewis Carroll, skip it.
Yeah. It's not a detailed analysis of the nonsense poems, but it's terrible title for a terrible book. Although with that caveat, I'd say, as always, bad McBain is better than quite a lot of other stuff, but
yes,
that one is pretty bad. And I mentioned before Ghosts, which quite a lot of people do like. That's from 1980, but I do not like at all. And when McBain wrote it, he said something which you've kind of mentioned earlier, which is like, when he writes the 87th Precinct, he uses that he can do anything in the 87th Precinct. He can do anything he wants. And this time he's decided to do ghosts. And it's not just he can be very clever with the titles he chooses. And he liked a good joke, he liked a pun and all that sort of stuff. But Ghosts features actual ghosts. And
yep.
That's just, it's insane that he did that. And I think he did it. He was asked about it at the time. And that's where that sort of thing is like, oh, I just do what I like with the 87th Precinct. No, I haven't been influenced by the sudden success of the Amityville Horror and all these things that have come out around this time. It's like, you clearly have. You've gone, I'll have a bit of that. And you've got these ghosts of Dutch settlers, and he does something very weird with Corella in that book, which is so totally not the character of Corella. If you picked that one up first, and I read it fairly early on, but thank goodness not the first one. I don't know what you'd think you'd be getting if you read that as the first one, whether it'd be like the X-Files meets the 87th Precinct and both of them lose. It's it's a weird one. So yeah, I'd steer clear of that. And then you mentioned a couple to me when we, in our prepping for this yes. as well. One of which turns up as a Columbo episode.
Well, we'll have to talk about that specifically, but yeah, go on. Let's do it.
Well, basically, if it's themed around a wedding, don't read it, is the rule with McBain books.
And there are 2, right?
Yeah, there are 2 specific ones. And it's very easy to spot because they're called Till Death and So Long As You Both Shall Live. And
I agree. They don't work.
it's cops doing cop stuff in situations where they shouldn't be doing cop stuff, even though things are happening to them at the time. And I know if you're a cop and something happens to you, you would obviously react. But what you would also do is call the correct cops to deal with it as well, because it's a thing that's happened to you. It's I don't no thank you.
I can see you getting flashbacks already just looking at you.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not good. I mean, they're thinly plotted. I mean, So Long As You Both Shall Live is maybe his shortest. It's very thin in every conceivable way, I think, and that's the last of his 70s books as well. I mean, so that before we get into the second period, as it were, it's the last of the short books, but it's kind of like the shortest of the short books, I think. Apart from, I think Axe might be the shortest and has the shortest title, but
even shorter in the American original title, when it's only two letters,
right? Yes, no second vowel. But I guess we could quickly talk about. I mean, we should talk about a little bit of McBain on screen, because he, of course, wrote a lot of screenplays himself.
Yeah.
I think always as Evan Hunter. I think all his screenplays are as by Evan Hunter. I don't think he ever wrote a screenplay as by Ed McBain. Could be wrong about that. So, I mean, we mentioned the Columbo. Let's get the Columbo out of the way because it's disastrous and everybody thinks so. So, okay. Weirdly, there are these two fairly late episodes of Columbo's from the 90s, which are based on two of the 87th Precinct novels. The horribly misguided So Long As You Both Shall Live, and the other one's Jigsaw, which is a much better book, and is in fact a slightly better episode, but not by much, because famously, So Long As You Both Shall Live becomes an episode that since been used, of course, for a Bond movie, which is No Time to Die. It was a deliberate departure. It's the one episode which even Falk made fun of. I don't know if you ever saw it. There was an episode of The Larry Sanders Show, right, where he appears as himself. And it was a mock talk show format. And he appears in that sort of saying, well, yeah, we just did this unusual episode of Columbo and, we're not sure how people are liking it, sort of thing. So he knew damn well that it was a departure, because it's not an inverted mystery. It's just somebody kidnaps someone at a wedding and they have to get them back. And that's the entire plot. And it's just horrible.
Did you spend the evening with this man?
He had some stuff that I needed to fix really bad.
Shut your trap! Shut yours! What were you doing before you came here?
Drinking beer.
He gave you this?
Yes. Can I have it?
Book him.
So as I understand it, Falk, being so central to Columbo as Columbo, does what a lot of people do, becomes executive producer, and he starts putting in script ideas and things like that. And he's like, well, who can we get to write some of these? Who's the best mystery writer? And someone says, McBain? And he goes, all right, get some McBains. And I think also, I don't know how clear-cut that is, because Peter Falk had appeared in the 87th Precinct TV series in the early 60s, as had some other people who turn up in Columbo later on as well. But essentially, that's what happens. And so they buy a couple, and they don't bother going, well, how do we make this a Columbo episode? How do we put Columbo's most significant trait, the inverted mystery, how do we fit this script into that? They don't. And it's just so weird. I mean, I'm looking at my notes about
Sadie, when she died, could have worked really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sadie is almost a Columbo episode, and I have written elsewhere in my notes, why was this not made into a Columbo episode? I've written, so my quote from my little thing about Columbo No Time to Die, I've written, this adaptation in particular varies so far from the series norm that it is in fact quite a good adaptation of an 87th Precinct story, but a dreadful episode of Columbo. There's no corpse, no murder walkthrough, no dogged pursuit of an individual. It's just Columbo at a wedding and having to deal with a kidnap. And they get him to use a gun, which
he shouldn't do.
In fact, and there's my note. Quite what led Falk to select these two stories in particular will never likely be known. Sadie, when she died, would have been perfect for a Columbo adaptation. So it's one of those things. Columbo and the 87th Precinct could have been a good fit if they'd have picked the right things, but as it was, it led to, this absolute nadir of one of the best crime shows on television.
Although Arthur Brown appears in it. That's one of the odd things. They do keep the Arthur Brown character.
Yeah, so...
in both of these episodes. The other one called Columbo Undercover.
Yeah.
Which is a bit better. But, I mean, it's just... It has Falk using various disguises, hence the undercover. And again, you're sort of watching, you're thinking, you guys really have run out of ideas. And in actual fact, they made several very good regular episodes of Columbo afterwards. They were just going through a very weird... And as you say, it's kind of like... It's like they didn't pay any attention of all the books they could have picked. And I think they could have picked them all. I can't imagine there were any that were off limits in terms of rights or things.
No, I don't know what it is. And it's...
Okay, well, let's not fixate too much on that. It is a catastrophe.
It's because everyone loves Columbo so much. And if you love Columbo and the 87th Precinct, it's like a dagger in your heart, isn't it? It's just
I do love Columbo.
Why didn't it work?
If only. So that didn't work. There was this 87th Precinct TV show in the 60s, ran for one season, 61 to 62. It had Jenna Rowlands as Teddy Corella, although she's only in a few episodes. Robert Lansing, who was, I think, okay as Corella.
I'm quite fond of him.
Yeah, I like Robert Lodger, who was in one of the early movies, who I think physically looks more the part. The kind of the way he describes the eyes, and which is obviously the McBain's own physiognomy. I think Lodger fits that even better. Admittedly, as a persona, you can see perhaps why he would not be the one you want to play Corella in a sort of long-running cop show. I think he was better at slightly troubled or difficult characters quite often, if not villains, in fact. He was excellent at villains. It's an okay TV show, but it is interesting because it adapts about, a dozen of the books almost, I think. So that's kind of great. And in fact, Hunter's involved in it because he, as Hunter, so the adaptation of
he does King's Ransom.
He does King's Ransom, thank you.
Yeah,
and does an original script, right?
Line of Duty. So Line of Duty is an original story by McBain that doesn't appear anywhere else in the 87th Precinct canon, but is in the TV series, which makes it unique in that sense. And it's an exploration into the impact that shooting someone will have on a cop, particularly a young cop, in this case, Bert Kling.
But he was only a kid, Steve. I mean, what was he, 18? Bert, you're a cop. Sometimes your job... I'm also a human being, Steve. Nobody says you can't be both. I killed a 33-year-old man with a wife and 2 kids. He also happened to be a burglar. Resisting arrest, he came at me with a bread knife. If I hadn't shot him, he would have stuck it in my heart. Bert, nobody wants to use that damn gun.
Ron Harper, who played Bert Kling in that series, is brilliant. He's a perfect bit of casting for the way they choose to portray that character. And we only lost Ron Harper, I think, last year, possibly, something like that.
Oh, right.
He was around for a long time and, it just seemed lovely. Yeah, it turns out that one of the best episodes of the 87th Precinct TV series is a new 87th Precinct story written by the guy who invented the 87th Precinct. Whereas some of the other ones, the adaptations, have to jettison so much to get it to fit into the runtime. And they've also done this terrible thing with Roger Haviland. Well, 2 terrible things. One, they cast Gregory Walcott, who I don't have any problem with necessarily as an actor, but he's not the right person for this show. They have to overdub him, post-dub him for most of his lines because he clearly mumbled so much that on set that it becomes very obvious that they've ADR'd him for a lot of it. But they've changed Roger Haviland to be a nice, friendly, sort of warm Southern guy, as opposed to the, as we previously described, shitbag of the series. Because obviously they weren't going to have that character on screen at all. It's interesting, and it's been out on DVD, and there's quite a lot of it online to look at as well. I'd say if people are interested, do spend some time with it.
It's interesting also because they definitely split one of the novels into 2, didn't they? They sort of took half the plot and half of one and used it in one episode, and then took the other half and used it in another episode. which is quite interesting, but very typical, of course, of the way that the books often are. They often have an A plot and a B plot.
Yes.
And so it's something that you can do. Thinking about other adaptations, I think he, with the notable exception of High and Low, the Akira Kurosawa 1963 film, which is an absolute classic,
Yes.
but which uses up the book of King's Ransom pretty much for the first hour, and then kind of goes its own merry way for the rest of it. And it's an incredible film. It's now been remade by Spike Lee as Highest to Lowest. I think a film that McBain seems to have liked. But I think you've pointed out that he kind of complained that not only were there other shows that were kind of using up his own approach, but that his own adaptations weren't ever especially faithful or successful, whether as a series or as one-offs. And I mean, I think the film of Fuzz, which has Yul Brynner as the deaf man and Burt Reynolds as Steve Carell, and actually I think Reynolds is pretty good casting as Steve Carell, actually. I think in terms of his kind of overall physical appearance, I think he suits the role. He's a decent enough actor. The persona's a little different, obviously, but it works. Tom Skerritt's quite fun in it, but they do mix and match the characters a bit. They change the characterization. Hunter did the screenplay. And again, it's one of these slightly odd things where they ended up shooting it in Boston.
Yeah, it was quite a journey to get it to the screen.
Yeah.
So, and it could have been shot anywhere for quite a while. It was have been in LA at one point, I think.
I think De Palma originally was going to direct it.
Yeah, it sounds mad to say that when you've seen Fuzz and it's this sort of hijinks comedy police thing, and then think it's De Palma was going to do that.
He was known primarily for comedies at that point.
Yeah, I suppose so.
He hadn't done any of his Hitchcockian pastiches yet. Things like Hi Mum and Getting to Know Your Rabbit. There were all these kind of anti-establishment type satirical comedies. So, but yes,
he walked. It took so long to get going, and he didn't have say on the casting. So that was one of the things that tipped him over the edge, and he left it.
And then I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen the film of Blood Relatives?
I have, yeah.
I mean, I think it's a really good book. In a way, it's a favourite of the books from that era. The shorter ones.
It's a great book.
I think it's a great book. The film, which was made by Claude Chabrol and stars Donald Sutherland as Cruella and is set in Canada, is a very, very peculiar movie. I mean, it's oddly
a
faithful,
difficult watch.
Yeah. They go in all kinds of strange directions, which make it very hard to take, actually.
A funny one. There's only a handful of what you'd call proper, films you would have seen in the cinema based on McBain's, and none of them particularly trumpet the fact that they are based on the 87th Precinct. And so by the time you get to Blood Relatives, it's not only made as a sort of French-Canadian production, it's not set. They're not making any attempt to set it in the 87th Precinct in not New York, things like that. It was shot in English. It was overdubbed into French. So it's got a new score by a British composer to replace the French score. It's got all this weird stuff going on, but it chooses to really highlight some of the hard, bleak, scary aspects of the book, which makes it quite a difficult thing to watch. Donald Pleasant's creepy as usual. David Hemmings can be very creepy, and he's in it, and he's very creepy in that. And apparently, Claude Chabrol chose to make it in Montreal rather than New York because he was terrified he was going to get mugged if he went to New York. So.
Have you seen the TV movie based on Ice?
Yes.
I think it's really good. I really like that.
You're crazy. Who's going to pay good money to be with a woman in my condition?
Oh, maybe that's a turn on to some guys.
Look, it's my 9th month. The gypsy says it's going to be a girl.
Yeah, that's great. You probably have her walking the streets in a few years.
You shouldn't say that, mister. Nothing like that is ever going to happen to her. She will never have that kind of life.
Hey, Andy.
What?
Why don't you give her a break? Either write her up or let her go.
Hey, Kling, what do you think? Should I let her walk? Whatever.
So I suppose that's a good way of dropping in the notion. You get the 87th Precinct series in the early 60s, and they kept trying to make 87th Precinct series. He was writing and developing one in the late 70s, early 80s, and then Hill Street Blues comes along and basically shuts down any chance he's going to get it made. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. But what this ultimately ends up being is it's 3 teleplays in the 90s, which are very 90s. The aesthetic of them is very 90s, but they are fairly good TV adaptations of, again, fairly dark stories from the series. They look so 90s TV now to modern eyes.
I mean, I like that one just because at least it tries to get the characters right, and
yes,
it sort of makes that effort. It's scripted by Larry Cohen, who had actually worked on the TV show in the 60s. So here he is, sort of more or less 30 years later. But it's the only one of those that I think is halfway decent. We should mention Hill Street Blues. Hill Street Blues is a terrific show that deserved all its prizes and so on and so forth, but did seriously annoy McBain stroke Hunter. He mentioned it in some of the books, doesn't he?
Yeah, so that becomes one of the funny things you get as it goes through the 80s, is the constant referencing back to Hill Street Blues. And whenever you see a reference in a book by McBain, you know it's something that's really annoyed him. There's several books where he refers to book reviewers by name. It's like he's not pretending. He's not making up a character to be. He's literally doing that. But yeah, Hill Street Blues came along, was instantly successful, and rightly so. It is phenomenal. It's some of the best TV ever made. But it's got a leading character cop who is essentially Italian American, like his character in the 87th Precinct. It's squad room based. But I mean, he was a litigious man, McBain. He would quite happily go to his lawyer first. And so the first thing he did was pick up the phone and go, "Have you seen this show? I want to sue them for stealing the 87th Precinct." And his lawyer went, "Okay, that's fine. We'll do that. It'll cost about $500,000 to fight it." And he's like, "Maybe we'll leave it then. And I'll just write about it in my books, and vent my spleen that way."
Well,
but he remained bitter because not only that, but it basically any chance of getting. So I think there is somewhere in his archives. I one day hope to get to go and see the archives, which are held at a university in Boston. There's a teleplay screenplay for Sadie when she died of that period, which I suspect would have been proposed for a new series of 87th Precinct.
Right.
And so what could have been,
that would have been great. I'd love to see a decent version of that. I really would. But it's a great book. It wouldn't be the right place to start. It's a great place to end, maybe, but it's a fantastic book in the series. It is kind of my favorite. I have lots of favorites, but that's sort of the one that I think stands up the best in a way, because I'm not sure. I mean, how do you feel they now stand up? I mean, the most recent of them is 20 years old. The oldest of them is a lot older than that. We're looking at a series that next year is going to be 70 years since the first one came out. How do you think they stand up?
The advantage of it now for them is that they are time capsules of the period in which they're written. And that's really interesting. The 50s ones particularly, because you're talking about a time before so much of the things that we're used to as mechanisms in crime stories existed. So regular use of radio systems between cars and policemen don't exist in those stories. The Miranda Escobedo rights don't exist in those stories. And so they very much feel like they're picking up from the 20 or 30 years before them, whereas you start to get through and then you start to see these things coming in, you see the impact of them. So you get a really good history lesson, and that's definitely to their favour, to their advantage as a reader now looking back over them. As long as you understand that, I don't think you'd go far wrong, really. Where they fall down is, as you get into the 80s, his use of sex as a mechanism in the books becomes so overbearing that it starts to become very much like this is gratuitous at this point. And like I say, this is a man who spent most of his time thinking about sex. It's very hard to read now because you would not describe, every time a woman walks into a scene, you do not describe their shape. It's ludicrous. It becomes quite ludicrous as part of it, even though he does definitely make an effort to try and include better female characters, and he does manage that. It's a tricky thing, and I think that's where you start to see it fall apart a little bit, for me anyway, and that's where it suffers. Even though the early ones do have a bit of the city was a woman, the curve of her streets was the curve of her thighs type thing.
Yes.
That feels much more in the Private Eye sort of vein of things, and it's forgivable is not the word, more understandable. than when he's actually just describing the woman's breasts every time there's a woman in a scene. Every cop, or not every cop, particularly cotton whores in the books, fantasizes about every woman they meet and what they would be like to sleep with. You know, it becomes quite tedious when you're reading a block of them in order.
So I think we're agreed the early ones are the best ones.
Yeah.
But it is a good 20 years of the early ones. And in fact, I think that more like 25 years. And I think there are some good ones later. I think Tricks is particularly good. I have a particular dislike for Vespers and Nocturne, actually. I tend to pick on those as ones that I really can't take. But in actual fact, there are good things in most of them. And I think the last one, Fiddlers, which I assume, given the page count, and obviously he was quite ill at the time, he ended up writing a book about his fight against laryngeal cancer called Let's Talk. I think that Fiddlers, his last book from 2005, and which was published posthumously, is probably a second rather than a third draft, I suppose, or one compared with the others. It's definitely shorter, but I think benefits from that, and it's still got good dialogue and a decent plot. And
definitely.
And I think it was a great way to go out. There was always this talk that he was one of those authors who had pre-planned for a final story. And there was this talk that there was one, and then it wasn't the case, right?
No, there wasn't. I think there was rumours swirling around in early internet days, because he adopted the internet. He had a forum and stuff like that. Before I really knew about him, and so I didn't get to sort of interact on that, but he would interact on that. But rumours were doing the rounds that there was one called Final Curtain, one was called Exit or something like that. Because it feels like he tried to have an off-ramp now and again in those last few years, as a result of his illness and the various hospitalizations and things like that. When you have The Last Dance as a title, for example, you wonder whether he thought maybe this is it. But then he goes on and writes 2 or 3 of the better later period ones, and Fiddlers has that sort of Fiddlers Have Fled notion to it. But yeah, as far as I understand it, there is no missing 87th Precinct book, and whether he even got as far as planning something to be a title, I don't know where those rumors came from. He did do a play that was put on posthumously called Final Curtain, which is his one attempt to get something on in the theatre that actually worked, and it didn't happen until he died. Bless him.
And on that note, not quite. So thanks for all of that. It's been a wonderful journey, very condensed journey through this amazing body of 55 works, which includes one novella in book shape and one collection of 3 novellas. I was going to ask you quickly if you wanted to make a recommendation of either a noirish or hard-boiled film or book that you'd recently read that you might want to recommend.
Yeah, I was looking through what we'd been watching recently, because we very often put film noirs on, and because you can buy those lovely sort of DVD box sets quite cheap of a lot of the classic sort of ones that have some of them noir, some are just straight down the line PI type things. But what we had been doing is watching quite a few Kurosawas. And whilst I have got the BFI Blu-ray of High and Low to watch, I have obviously seen that film before, but we watched Drunken Angel recently, which is 1948, and it's not strictly noir, but takes plenty of noir influence and the moral ambiguity and the decisions people are making in that, to make that story work. The one I watched before that was The Big Heat.
Oh, the Glenn Ford, sensational film.
Absolutely brilliant. So those are 2 recent ones that I've watched and really, really enjoyed. In the past couple of years, with things like Pick Up on South Street and things like that have been revelations, because I've never seen them before, and they're just fascinating.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, Sam Fuller's always a good investment.
Yeah. Novels wise, I've not read anything hard boiled for a while, but crime fiction wise, what I've been doing is I've been trying to read more Japanese stuff, because they just have such a brilliant obsession with Western crime storytelling that they reformat, and so many of those writers out of Japan do such great work with these things. And that's why the 87th Precinct was really popular in Japan. There's more 87th Precinct TV over there than there is anywhere else. I wish I could see it. But I was reading, have been reading the books by Seishi Yokomizo, whose character is Kosuke Kindaichi. So that's a bit more in the Poirot sort of Sherlock Holmes mold of things. But they're great. A few locked room mysteries with that one. And I recently I was lent a book by Yukito Ayatsuji, forgive me for the pronunciation, from 1987 called The Decagon House Murders, which is another retelling of Agatha Christie, everyone on an island getting bumped off. And it's a phenomenal book. I read it and I got to the end. I said, this is unfilmable, because if you film this, I cannot see any mechanism in which this book can be made into a film, because it would instantly give the plot away. And I said that, went on Wikipedia, and a film of it came out in 2024 in Japan. So there you go. What do I know?
You've got to see it. Oh, come on.
I know. I really want to see it now, and how they've done it, because I hope they've made a good mechanism of it.
Well, I've got to read that now. Okay, I'm going to look forward to that. So do you think you might come back to doing a few more McBain podcasts for your Hark series? Have I inspired you?
Yeah, I do love it, and I do love the fact that I've done all this research. I've got much more research now than when we were doing the series. The idea is that I will eventually write an 87th Precinct, a book about the 87th Precinct and McBain. I have some biographical details of McBain that aren't, I don't think, particularly well known or haven't been sort of put together the way I've done it so far. Hopefully I'll A, manage to get that done, and B, get some more Hark, the 87th Precinct podcast episodes out, because there are plenty of films we haven't looked at. There's more of the TV series from the 60s I'd like to look at. And, I appreciate our adoring fans have been hanging on for this long, desperately refreshing their feeds since 2022 to see if we've turned up to...
Well, that's right, Paul. Get your finger out. Come on.
Yeah. The irony was the very last episode we recorded, the bonus episode after the last book, it was the first time that the SD card in the recorder cut out by the end. So literally it just stops. It just stops flat. And that was it. And so I stuck in a record scratch sound, and that's how it ended so far. So
it's a sign. Yes. Well, definitely on that note, thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to reading all your forthcoming McBain and 87th Precinct research. I can't wait. That sounds marvellous. I shan't hold you to a publication date, but
no.
do it for us.
Well, publishers, get in touch and make me do it.
Excellent.
Yeah. Somebody give me a deadline. Otherwise, I will just be doing this till the day I die.
Well, thank you very much. And now I think I've got to go and start rereading some of those books again. It's been too long. I think I've got to pick some of those favorites again. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.